Hey guys, tonight we begin with something a little more gilded, but no less brutal. A time of crowns, conspiracies, and royal bloodshed. We're diving into what life was really like for medieval queens. Forget the fairy tales and Disney princess fantasies Hollywood sold you. The truth? You probably wouldn't last a single day. So before you settle in, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. And let me know in the comments where you're tuning in from and what time it is for you. It's always fascinating to see who's joining us from around the world. Now dim the lights, maybe turn on that fan for some soft background hum, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. Congratulations, you've just woken up as Queen Isabella of somewhere medieval Europe in the year 1347. The good news? You're alive and technically the most powerful woman in the kingdom. The bad news? That crown on your head might as well be a target, and half the people bowing to you are probably plotting your downfall before breakfast. Your bed isn't the luxurious four-poster you might imagine. It's a wooden frame stuffed with straw and feathers, covered in heavy tapestries that haven't been washed since your coronation 3 years ago. The sheets, if you can call them that, are rough linen that chafes against your skin. But you can't complain. Complaining is unqueenly, and being unqueenly can get you divorced, exiled, or worse. The castle around you is a stone refrigerator. No central heating, just massive fireplaces that barely warm the corners, while the rest of the room remains perpetually frigid. Your windows? Narrow slits designed more for shooting arrows than letting in light, and they're covered with oiled parchment, not glass. The wind whistles through gaps in the stone walls that you could fit your fist through. You blink awake as the chapel bell clangs in the distance, calling you to morning prayers. Because yes, even queens don't get to sleep in. Your day is scheduled from dawn to dusk, every moment accounted for, every action scrutinised by advisors, courtiers, and enemies who all want something from you. Your chamber is shared not just with your ladies-in-waiting, but with servants, guards, and occasionally random nobles who need to petition you at ungodly hours. Privacy? That's a luxury you surrendered when you took the crown. Even your most intimate moments are witnessed, recorded, and gossiped about in every corner of the kingdom. Welcome to morning in medieval royalty, where being queen means you're never truly alone, because courtiers, spies, and assassins are always watching. And this is just how your day starts. It only gets more dangerous from here. So you've managed to extract yourself from your medieval royal haystack of obligations. Congratulations. Now comes the morning ritual that could literally kill you. Getting dressed. And I don't mean dying from embarrassment. I mean actual physical death. First, there's the matter of your undergarments. A rough linen chemise that serves as your only barrier against the wool and silk that will be layered on top. No bra, obviously, just a tight-fitting bodice that will compress your ribs for the next 16 hours. Breathing deeply is for peasants. Next comes the corset. Not the romanticised version you see in movies, but a rigid contraption of whalebone, wood, and iron that squeezes your internal organs into new and interesting configurations. Tight lacing isn't just fashion, it's a political statement. A queen must have a wasp waist to prove her moral virtue and self-control. Never mind that it's slowly crushing your liver. The dress itself is an architectural marvel of impossibility. Layers upon layers of silk, velvet and brocade, each one heavier than the last. The sleeves alone weigh as much as a small child, and are so tight you can't lift your arms above shoulder height. The skirt is supported by hoops and frames that make it impossible to sit down properly. You'll spend the entire day standing or perching awkwardly on the edge of chairs. And then there's the jewellery. Not the delicate pieces you might imagine, but heavy, ostentatious displays of wealth designed to remind everyone that you could buy and sell them. Necklaces that strain your neck, bracelets that cut circulation, rings that make it impossible to use your hands properly. Each piece is a golden shackle, beautiful but burdensome, The headdress is perhaps the most dangerous part. Tall, elaborate constructions of wire, fabric and jewels that can weigh up to 10 pounds. They're balanced precariously on your head and secured with pins that dig into your scalp. One wrong move and the entire structure comes crashing down, potentially taking an eye with it. Your shoes, if you can call them that, are soft leather slippers with no support, no grip, and certainly no comfort. You'll spend the day navigating stone floors slick with rushes, grease, and God knows what else, always one misplaced step away from a fall that could break your neck. Getting dressed as a medieval queen isn't just uncomfortable, it's a daily death trap. Every garment is a potential hazard, every accessory a weapon turned against your own body. But you wear it all with a smile, because showing weakness, even admitting that your shoes hurt, could be seen as unfitness to rule. Now that you're properly armoured in silk and suffering, it's time to face the morning court, where your real education in survival begins. You've survived the torture chamber that is royal fashion, and now it's time for your morning audience. But first, let's talk about what's going into your royal mouth. Because in the Middle Ages, even queens aren't safe from death by breakfast. Your morning meal is served on gold plates, which sounds lovely, until you realise that's because silver was thought to detect poison by tarnishing. The gold might be pretty, but it's also a constant reminder that someone somewhere is probably trying to kill you with your cornflakes. Speaking of which, you're not eating cornflakes. You're eating white bread, which is a luxury reserved for royalty and slowly killing you with its complete lack of nutrition. It's made from refined flour that's been stripped of everything your body actually needs. But brown bread is for peasants, and a queen eating peasant food would be a scandal that could undermine your authority. Your meat, if it's available, has been hanging in the castle's cool rooms for weeks. There's no refrigeration, just salt, smoke, and prayer. The beef might be gamey, the pork might be turning, and the chicken is definitely questionable. But you eat it anyway, because refusing food in front of your court suggests either illness or ingratitude to God. The ale you're drinking with breakfast, because even as a queen, water is a death trap, is weak and often sour. But at least it won't give you dysentery, which is more than you can say for anything else liquid in the castle. And every bite, every sip, every morsel that passes your lips has been tasted first by a food taster. A poor soul whose job is to die in your place if your cook has been bribed by your enemies. You watch their face carefully as they chew, looking for signs of distress, convulsions, or the telltale foam that means your porridge has been laced with arsenic. But here's the truly terrifying part. Poison was an art form in medieval courts. A skilled assassin could use substances that took hours or even days to take effect, meaning your taster could drop dead tomorrow from something they ate today. You live in constant uncertainty, never knowing if this meal will be your last. Even the spices that flavour your food are dangerous. Imported at great expense from the East, they often arrive contaminated with God knows what. That exotic saffron might be cut with lead. The black pepper could be mixed with ground insects. The cinnamon might actually be tree bark sprayed with urine. Your breakfast isn't just a meal, it's a game of Russian roulette played 3 times a day. Every bite could be your last, and every swallow requires an act of faith that your kitchen staff likes you more than your enemy's gold. So you sit at your high table, smiling graciously while internally calculating the odds that your morning porridge has been weaponized. Welcome to royal dining, where every meal is potentially your funeral feast. Now that you've successfully navigated breakfast without dying, it's time for the main event, your morning court. This is where the real danger begins, because in medieval politics, everyone is an enemy, even your friends. Your throne room is designed to intimidate, high vaulted ceilings that make your voice echo, cold stone floors that hurt to kneel on, and massive tapestries depicting your ancestors defeating their enemies. The message is clear: respect the crown or join the bodies in the battlefield scenes above your head. You sit on your throne, which, despite its gold leaf and velvet cushions, is fundamentally a very expensive, very uncomfortable chair. While a parade of petitioners approaches, each one bows, scrapes, and presents their case while you try to decipher what they actually want versus what they're pretending to want. Lord Robert approaches with a land dispute. Seems simple enough until you realise he's actually testing whether you'll side with him over Lord William, who happens to be married to your cousin. Choose wrong, and you've just created an enemy who knows exactly which wine you prefer and has access to your private chambers. Lady Margaret requests permission to marry her daughter to a minor noble. Sweet, right? Wrong. The minor noble is actually the son of your husband's political rival, and this marriage would create an alliance that could threaten your own children's claims to inheritance. The bishop arrives with concerns about heretics in the northern provinces, but is he genuinely worried about religious purity, or is he trying to convince you to seize the lands of wealthy merchants he's labelled as heretical? Choose poorly, and you're either a weak ruler who allows heresy to flourish, or a tyrant who persecutes innocent merchants. Every decision you make ripples outward, like a stone thrown into a pond. Approve a trade agreement, and you've angered the guilds who compete with foreign merchants. Deny a marriage petition, and you've insulted a family who might remember the slight when your son needs allies 20 years from now. And through it all, you must appear wise, just, and divinely guided. Any hesitation is seen as weakness. Any emotion is seen as instability. You're expected to make complex political calculations instantly while maintaining the serene expression of someone who definitely talks to God on a regular basis. Your advisors whisper in your ears, each pushing their own agenda. Your chancellor wants you to raise taxes. Your marshal wants you to declare war on the neighbouring kingdom. Your treasurer wants you to cut spending on everything except his own department. Your confessor wants you to donate more money to the church, conveniently forgetting that the church already owns a third of your kingdom. Meanwhile, foreign ambassadors watch every gesture, every word, every micro-expression, sending reports back to their own kingdoms about your strengths, weaknesses, and potential vulnerabilities. That Spanish envoy isn't just here to discuss trade routes. He's gathering intelligence for a possible invasion. Court isn't governance, it's performance art with lethal consequences. One wrong word, one misinterpreted gesture, one political miscalculation, and you could find yourself facing rebellion, invasion, or a mysterious illness that looks suspiciously like poisoning. You dismiss the court with royal grace, having made a dozen decisions that could either strengthen your realm or destroy it. And the truly terrifying part, you won't know which until it's too late to change course. Now that you've survived the political minefield of morning court, it's time to address the more immediate threats to your continued breathing. Because in medieval Europe, being queen doesn't just make you powerful, it makes you a target for every ambitious noble, foreign kingdom, and religious fanatic within 1,000 miles. Let's start with your own family, because nothing says medieval politics like relatives who want you dead. Your brother-in-law has been eyeing your throne since your wedding day, convinced he could rule better than your husband. Your sister, married to a duke in the neighbouring kingdom, might be gathering intelligence for a potential invasion. Your own mother-in-law views you as a foreign interloper who stole her son and corrupted her bloodline. Even your children aren't safe from suspicion. Your teenage son is approaching the age where ambitious nobles might convince him that he'd make a better ruler than his parents. History is full of princes who, reluctantly, accepted the crown after their mothers mysteriously died in their sleep. Your husband, theoretically your closest ally, is also your greatest vulnerability. If he dies, your power dies with him, unless you can navigate the treacherous waters of regency. And if he decides you're no longer useful? Medieval divorce often came with a side of exile, imprisonment, or convenient accidents. Foreign threats are equally terrifying. the French court has been making diplomatic inquiries about trade routes that happen to pass through your most strategically important castles. The Holy Roman Emperor has been asking pointed questions about your kingdom's military capabilities. The Pope has been receiving reports about your insufficient piety, which could be the prelude to excommunication and the free-for-all that follows. Religious conflicts add another layer of danger. Are you Catholic enough for the Church? Too Catholic for the nobles who want to raid monastery lands? Supportive enough of the Crusades? Too supportive, bleeding your treasury dry? In a world where politics and religion are inseparable, every theological opinion is a potential death sentence. Assassination attempts aren't rare, they're routine. Your food taster isn't just for show. Your bodyguards sleep outside your door, not for honour, but because knife-wielding fanatics have a disturbing tendency to try sneaking into royal bedchambers. Your clothing is checked for poisoned pins. Your cosmetics are tested for toxic compounds. Your prayer book is examined for hidden blades. The methods are limited only by imagination. Poisoned gloves that absorb through the skin. Bouquets of flowers soaked in toxic oils. Perfumed letters that kill when inhaled. Books with pages treated with contact poisons. Even your communion wine isn't safe. More than one medieval ruler met their maker while taking the body and blood of Christ. Spies are everywhere. Your servants report to foreign governments. Your ladies-in-waiting write coded letters to enemy courts. Your confessors share your secrets with ambitious bishops. The very walls of your castle have ears, and those ears belong to people who would sell your life for a handful of silver coins. Even natural death is suspicious when you're wearing a crown. Sudden illness could be poison. Accidents might be sabotage. The line between bad luck and assassination attempts blurs when everyone has a motive to see you gone. You live in a constant state of hypervigilance, analysing every gift for hidden threats, every friendly gesture for underlying malice, every piece of seemingly innocent information for its potential to be used against you. Paranoia isn't a character flaw when you're a medieval queen. It's a survival skill. And the truly exhausting part? You have to hide all of this behind a mask of serene confidence. A queen who appears nervous or suspicious is a queen who looks weak. And weakness invites challenges that you might not survive. So you smile at the nobles who whisper about your downfall, dine with the ambassadors who sketch your castle's defences, and sleep beside the husband who might sign your death warrant if the political winds change. All while pretending that being queen is a divine gift rather than a daily death sentence. Welcome to royal life, where the crown might be gold, but it's also a bullseye painted on your forehead. You've made it through the morning's assassination attempts and political calculations, but now comes perhaps the most dangerous part of any medieval Queen's Day, dealing with the Church. Because in a world where spiritual authority often trumps royal authority, one wrong move with the clergy can turn you from God's anointed ruler into a heretical enemy of Christ. Your relationship with the Church is a delicate balancing act that would make a tightrope walker nervous. On one hand, you need the Church's support to legitimize your rule. Medieval people believed that kings and queens ruled by divine right, which means God's representatives on earth. Bishops, abbots, and the Pope himself hold significant power over your political survival. On the other hand, the Church wants things from you, lots of things. Money for new cathedrals, land for new monasteries, political support for their theological positions, and military backing for their various crusades and holy wars. Say no too often, and you risk excommunication, which essentially gives every noble in your kingdom permission to rebel against your ungodly rule. Your morning starts with mandatory prayers in the castle chapel. This isn't optional spiritual reflection, it's political theatre. Your courtiers watch to see how devoutly you pray, how generously you donate, how carefully you follow religious protocols. A yawn during Mass gets reported to bishops. A missed donation gets whispered about in confessionals across the kingdom. The Bishop of Winchester arrives for his weekly audience, and you immediately know he wants something expensive. His smile is too wide, his blessings too effusive, his concerns about your spiritual welfare too detailed. He mentions quite casually that the cathedral's roof needs repairs that will cost roughly half your annual tax revenue. You can't simply refuse. That would mark you as miserly and potentially heretical. But you also can't afford to fund every church project in your kingdom. Your treasury isn't infinite, and your nobles are already grumbling about taxes. So you promise to consider the request and pray for divine guidance, diplomatic language that buys you time while satisfying no one. Then there's the question of religious reform. Some bishops want you to crack down on heretical movements that are allegedly spreading through your kingdom. Others warn you that religious persecution makes you look tyrannical and unstable. The Pope wants you to support his latest theological position, but your neighbouring kingdoms think that same position is dangerous extremism. Your personal religious beliefs, assuming you have any beyond political necessity, must be carefully hidden if they don't align with current orthodox positions. Question transubstantiation. Heresy. Suggest that maybe the clergy shouldn't own a third of all land in your kingdom. Blasphemy. Wonder aloud why God allows so much suffering in your realm. Dangerous theological speculation that could be twisted into evidence of insufficient faith. The Inquisition is always lurking in the background, ready to investigate reports of royal heresy. They have the power to declare you an enemy of the faith, which essentially puts a divine bounty on your head. Every word you speak in confession could be used against you. Every theological question you ask could be interpreted as doubt. Every moment of anger or despair could be labelled as rebellion against God's will. Your marriage adds another layer of religious complexity. Did you marry for love? Suspicious, royal marriages should be about political alliance, not carnal desire. Having trouble conceiving an heir? Obviously, God is displeased with your union. Too many children? Perhaps you're more focused on earthly pleasures than spiritual duties. Not enough children? Your bloodline might be cursed. Even your charitable works are scrutinized for religious correctness. Give to the poor, but not too much. Excessive charity suggests you're trying to buy salvation rather than earning it through faith. Too little charity marks you as hard-hearted and unchristian. Support the wrong religious orders, and you're playing favourites in ways that could destabilise church politics. Your daily schedule must accommodate multiple religious obligations that eat up hours you desperately need for actual governance. Morning prayers, evening prayers, feast day celebrations, holy day observances, religious processions, cathedral dedications, and the endless cycle of Christian holidays that demand royal participation. And through all of this, you must appear not just compliant, but genuinely devout. Medieval people could spot a faker, and rumours of royal religious insincerity spread faster than plague. You need to convince everyone, courtiers, clergy, foreign ambassadors, and your own subjects, that you truly believe God chose you to rule and continues to guide your decisions. The truly terrifying part is that the Church's political positions change. Today's orthodox belief becomes tomorrow's heresy. Supporting the wrong theological argument could retroactively make you an enemy of the faith. You're expected to navigate shifting religious politics while maintaining the appearance of unwavering, divinely inspired certainty. So you kneel in chapel, donate to causes you can't afford, smile at bishops who want to bankrupt your kingdom, and pray that your political calculations align with whatever God apparently told the Pope last week. Because in medieval Europe, being queen means serving two masters, your kingdom and your church, and they don't always want the same things. The sun is climbing higher, and you've successfully avoided death by politics and heresy for several hours. Congratulations! Now comes the part of your day where you're expected to actually rule something, which in medieval times means managing a kingdom that's constantly teetering on the edge of economic collapse. Your treasurer approaches with this month's financial reports, and his expression tells you everything you need to know before he opens his mouth. The kingdom is broke. Again. Your tax collectors have been murdered by angry peasants in 3 different provinces. The harvest was poor due to unusual weather patterns that your court astronomers claim were caused by the alignment of Saturn and Mars, but which your farmers blame on your insufficient piety. The numbers are staggering in their awfulness. Your military expenses, maintaining knights, horses, weapons, and fortifications, consume roughly 60% of your annual income. The church expects 20% in tithes and donations. Your own household, including the army of servants, courtiers, and hangers-on required to maintain royal dignity, costs another 15%. That leaves 5% to run an entire kingdom. But wait, there's more bad news. The neighbouring kingdom has defaulted on the loans you extended during their famine 3 years ago. The Italian merchant banks are demanding payment on debts your predecessors accumulated. Your own nobles are behind on their tax obligations because their serfs are dying of a mysterious wasting disease that might be God's punishment for something you did wrong. War, of course, is bankrupting you faster than you can tax your subjects. Even a minor border skirmish costs more than most kingdoms earn in a year. Knights require expensive equipment that's constantly being damaged or lost. Horses need food, care, and replacement when they're killed in battle. Mercenaries want payment in actual money, not promises of future glory. Your siege engines are literally falling apart, held together with prayers and increasingly desperate engineering. Your castles need constant maintenance that you can't afford. The walls are crumbling, the towers are tilting, and the moats are filled with debris because you can't pay workers to clean them out. Trade, theoretically a source of income, is being strangled by the guild system that makes innovation nearly impossible, and foreign competition nearly treasonous. Your merchants want protection from bandits, but you can't afford to patrol every trade route. Your artisans want exclusive privileges that drive up costs for everyone else. Your farmers want tax relief that you can't provide without bankrupting the kingdom. Currency manipulation is a constant temptation and a constant threat. Devalue your coins to stretch your gold reserves, and merchants will refuse to accept your currency. Maintain the gold content, and you run out of money to mint new coins. Foreign exchange rates fluctuate based on rumours, wars, and the phases of the moon, apparently. Taxation is the most politically dangerous part of your financial responsibilities. Raise taxes, and your nobles revolt. Lower taxes, and your kingdom crumbles from lack of funds. Create new taxes, and you're accused of tyranny. Fail to collect existing taxes, and you're accused of weakness. Tax the church, and you're a heretic. Don't tax the church, and your secular nobles accuse you of favouritism. Your economic advisors offer competing solutions that would make modern economists weep. One suggests increasing agricultural production by forcing more peasants to work the land, ignoring the fact that most peasants are already working themselves to death. Another recommends expanding trade by building more roads, somehow overlooking the minor detail that you have no money to build roads. The most creative advisor suggests solving your financial problems by marrying your daughter to a wealthy foreign prince, essentially selling your child to balance the kingdom's books. This is not only morally questionable, but also politically dangerous. Foreign marriages can become pretexts for foreign invasions when the new son-in-law decides he deserves a crown of his own. Meanwhile, your subjects are suffering through their own economic catastrophes. Famine is always lurking one bad harvest away. Disease decimates both human and animal populations, destroying the tax base you desperately need. Natural disasters, floods, droughts, early frosts, late springs, can wipe out a year's worth of economic progress in a matter of weeks. You're expected to provide economic relief during disasters while maintaining the royal lifestyle that proves God still favours your rule. It's an impossible balancing act. Appear wealthy enough to demonstrate divine approval, but not so wealthy that your starving subjects decide you're hoarding resources during their time of need. The truly maddening part is that economic theory barely exists in your time period. You're trying to manage complex financial systems with accounting methods that wouldn't challenge a modern middle school student. Most of your financial records are kept by monks who are more interested in copying religious texts than tracking royal spending. So you sit in your counting chamber, surrounded by ledgers that don't balance, promises that won't be kept, and advisors who have no idea how to fix any of it. You make decisions about taxation, spending, and economic policy that will either save your kingdom or destroy it, and you won't know which until it's far too late to change course. Welcome to medieval economic management, where every financial decision is a gamble with your kingdom's survival, and the house always seems to be winning. By midday, you've survived assassination attempts, religious politics, and economic catastrophe. Now comes the part of your royal schedule that sounds pleasant, but is actually a refined form of psychological torture: entertaining guests. Because in medieval politics, every social interaction is a diplomatic minefield where the wrong gesture can trigger wars. Your great hall has been prepared for the arrival of Duke William of Somerset and his entourage. This visit isn't social, it's political. The Duke controls strategic castles along your border, commands significant military forces, and has been making disturbing inquiries about your succession plans. He's either here to negotiate an alliance or to assess your weaknesses before declaring war. The feast preparation alone has cost more than your kingdom earns in a month. Imported spices, exotic meats, rare wines, and enough food to feed a small army for a week. Not because your guests are particularly hungry, but because royal hospitality is a display of power. Serve simple food and you appear weak. Serve exotic delicacies and you demonstrate that your kingdom is prosperous enough to afford luxuries. But here's where it gets dangerous. Every aspect of this feast is a political statement that can be misinterpreted with lethal consequences. Seat the Duke too close to your throne, and you're acknowledging his importance in ways that might threaten other nobles. Seat him too far away, and you're insulting his rank in ways that could justify military retaliation. The order of service matters. Serve the Duke first, and you're showing respect that might be interpreted as weakness or submission. Serve him after other guests, and you're displaying dominance that might provoke his anger. The type of meat served to each guest, the quality of wine poured, even the colour of the tablecloth. Every detail is scrutinised for hidden meanings. Your conversation must be a masterpiece of diplomatic ambiguity. Too friendly, and you appear naive or desperate for alliance. Too formal, and you seem hostile or arrogant. Ask about his family, and you might accidentally reference the son who died in a hunting accident that everyone suspects was actually an assassination. Compliment his lands, and you might be seen as expressing territorial ambition. The Duke's entourage includes spies disguised as courtiers, diplomats disguised as entertainers, and probably at least one assassin disguised as a servant. Your own staff has been infiltrated by his agents, who are reporting back on everything from your table manners to your sleeping arrangements. Every word you speak will be analysed for signs of weakness, aggression, or exploitable information. Entertainment adds another layer of complexity. Your court musicians must perform songs that honour your guests without accidentally including ballads about historical defeats of their ancestors. Your jesters must be funny without being offensive, clever without being too clever, and entertaining without saying anything that could be interpreted as political commentary. The gift exchange is a particularly treacherous ritual. Offer gifts that are too expensive, and you appear to be trying to buy alliance or loyalty. Offer gifts that are too modest, and you insult your guest's importance. The Duke's gifts to you must be carefully examined for hidden messages, poison, and magical curses. Because yes, people actually believed in magical assassination attempts. Dancing requires physical coordination you've never developed while wearing 10 pounds of jewellery and a dress that weighs more than armour. But refusing to dance insults your guests, while dancing poorly suggests weakness or illness. Every step is observed, every stumble noted, every interaction with male guests scrutinised for signs of impropriety. Your ladies in waiting are under enormous pressure to represent your court favourably, while avoiding any behaviour that could be interpreted as seductive, weak, or politically naive. They're essentially diplomatic hostages. Their behaviour reflects on your judgment, and their safety depends on your guests' goodwill. The religious aspects of medieval hospitality add another complication. You must pray before meals, but your prayers must acknowledge your guests' religious sensibilities without compromising your own theological positions. The wrong blessing could mark you as insufficiently pious or dangerously heretical. Alcohol consumption requires careful calibration. Drink too little and you appear suspicious or inhospitable. Drink too much and you risk saying something that could start a war. Your guests are trying to get you drunk enough to reveal useful information, while avoiding getting drunk enough to reveal their own secrets. The feast continues for hours, during which you must maintain perfect royal composure, while navigating conversation topics that include trade disputes, marriage alliances, military capabilities, religious obligations, and historical grievances. One careless comment about past conflicts could reignite territorial disputes that have been dormant for decades. Even the end of the evening is politically fraught. Dismiss your guests too early, and you appear rude or eager to be rid of them. Keep them too late, and you seem desperate for their approval or afraid to be alone. The rituals of departure, final toasts, formal farewells, gift presentations, all carry diplomatic weight that could determine whether you wake up tomorrow to alliance offers or invasion threats. So you smile through hours of political theatre, disguised as social pleasantry, knowing that every gesture is being analysed for weaknesses and every word is being memorised for future use against you. Medieval entertaining isn't about having fun, it's about surviving social situations where the wrong fork selection could literally trigger international incidents. As the sun begins its descent toward evening, you've successfully navigated diplomatic dinners and political performances, but now comes perhaps the most personally devastating part of your royal existence: your complete and utter lack of privacy, autonomy, or personal relationships that aren't calculated for political advantage. Let's start with your marriage, which is less of a romantic relationship and more of a strategic alliance between kingdoms that happens to involve sharing a bed. You didn't choose your husband based on affection, compatibility, or attraction. You married him because your kingdoms needed to be connected. Your bloodlines needed to be merged, or your fathers needed to settle territorial disputes without going to war. Your husband might be kind, or he might be cruel, or he might be completely indifferent to your existence, except when it's time to produce heirs. Love, if it develops at all, is a bonus rather than an expectation. More likely, you've developed a working relationship based on mutual political necessity and the shared understanding that you're both trapped in roles you never chose. Physical intimacy is a royal duty rather than personal pleasure. Your ability to conceive male heirs determines your political value and possibly your survival. Fail to produce sons and you risk being divorced, exiled, or quietly eliminated in favour of a more fertile replacement. Produce too many daughters, and whispers start about God's displeasure with your union. Your children, when they arrive, aren't really yours in any meaningful sense. They belong to the kingdom, to the bloodline, to the political necessity of succession. You don't get to parent them based on your own values or preferences. Their education, marriages, and life paths are determined by political considerations rather than their individual talents or desires. Worse yet, your children are potential weapons that can be used against you. Ambitious nobles might try to turn your sons against you by convincing them they'd make better rulers. Foreign kingdoms might demand your daughters in marriage to cement alliances you'd rather not make. Your children's survival often depends on their political usefulness rather than your maternal love. Friendship is nearly impossible when everyone around you wants something. Your ladies-in-waiting report your conversations to their families. Your female relatives measure every word for potential political advantage. Your servants are loyal to whoever pays them best, and that might not be you when times get difficult. Even your spiritual relationships are compromised. Your confessor might be reporting your sins to church authorities who could use them for political leverage. Your private prayers might be interpreted as evidence of heretical thinking if they don't align with current orthodox positions. Your daily schedule is controlled by protocol, tradition, and political necessity, rather than your personal preferences. Wake up when the protocol demands, eat what the kitchen provides, wear what royal dignity requires, speak to whoever political necessity dictates, and go to sleep when royal scheduling permits. Your emotions must be constantly regulated and performed rather than genuinely experienced. Anger might be interpreted as instability. Sadness might suggest weakness. Joy might seem inappropriate during difficult times. Even your facial expressions are political statements that can be misinterpreted with dangerous consequences. You can't travel freely, explore your kingdom unguarded, or experience life outside the artificial bubble of royal protection. Every outing is planned, every route secured, every interaction choreographed. You rule over thousands of subjects you'll never meet and lands you'll never see. Your intellectual development is limited to what's considered appropriate for royal women, which typically excludes anything that might make you too clever or independent. Reading is permitted, but only certain books. Theological study is encouraged, but only within approved boundaries. Political theory is forbidden territory that could make you dangerously well-informed about your own situation. Your health is constantly monitored, discussed, and politicized. Illness might suggest divine displeasure or political weakness. Medical treatments are chosen as much for their symbolic value as their therapeutic benefits. Even your menstrual cycle is tracked and analysed for political implications. The isolation is perhaps the most psychologically devastating aspect of royal life. You're surrounded by hundreds of people, but truly known by none. Your real thoughts, feelings, fears and desires must be hidden behind a mask of royal composure that never slips, never cracks, never reveals the human being trapped inside the political institution. You can't even be certain which of your apparent successes are real, and which are simply courtiers telling you what they think you want to hear. Your judgment might be terrible, your decisions disastrous, your policies harmful, but you'll never know because everyone around you has political reasons to praise your wisdom. So as evening approaches and you prepare for another night of royal insomnia, because paranoia and isolation don't make for restful sleep, you contemplate the golden cage that is your existence. You have power over everyone except yourself, authority over everything except your own life, and wealth that can't buy you the one thing you desperately want: freedom. Welcome to medieval queenship, where the crown isn't just heavy, it's a prison made of gold. As darkness falls over your kingdom, you might think the day's dangers are over. You'd be wrong, because for a medieval queen, nighttime brings its own special collection of terrors, most of which involve people trying to kill you while you sleep. Your bedchamber isn't the private sanctuary you might imagine. It's more like a carefully monitored security checkpoint, where privacy is a luxury you can't afford, and sleep is a vulnerability that could get you murdered. Your bed is positioned so that guards can see it from multiple angles, but also so that potential assassins can't approach from hidden directions. The ritual of preparing for sleep is an elaborate security theatre. Your ladies-in-waiting examine every piece of fabric for hidden weapons, poison, or magical charms. Your mattress is checked for knives, your pillows inspected for toxic powders, your bed sheets analysed for contact poisons that could kill you through skin absorption. Your nightgown, handmade by trusted servants under close supervision, is still examined for poisoned threads or hidden blades. Even your chamber pot is inspected, because creative assassins have been known to hide explosive devices in the most unexpected places. The food and drink in your bedchamber, a light evening meal, perhaps some wine to help you sleep, undergoes the same poisoning protocols as your formal meals. Everything is tasted, tested, and triple-checked before it's allowed anywhere near your royal person. But physical threats are only part of your nighttime concerns. Medieval people believed in supernatural assassination methods with the same seriousness they believed in conventional poison. Your chambers are blessed by priests to ward off evil spirits. Holy relics are placed around your bed to prevent demonic possession. Protective charms hang from the rafters to deflect magical curses. Your sleep schedule itself is a security risk. Sleep too soundly, and you won't wake up if assassins break in. Sleep too lightly, and you'll be exhausted and vulnerable during the next day's political challenges. Medieval sleeping aids, herbal remedies, wine, warm milk, all carry the risk of being drugged with more sinister substances. The guards outside your door are theoretically there to protect you, but they're also potential threats. Night guards are often chosen from foreign mercenaries who have no local political loyalties, but that also means they have no personal investment in your survival. They're protecting you for money, and money can be offered by your enemies as easily as by your treasury. Your husband sleeping beside you presents its own complications. Is he genuinely asleep, or is he pretending while listening to your unconscious mumbling for politically useful information? Medieval marriages often involved spouses spying on each other for different political factions. The person closest to you might literally be closest to your secrets. Dreams themselves become political territory. Medieval people believed that dreams could be divine revelations, demonic temptations, or prophetic visions. If you talk in your sleep about anything that could be interpreted as treasonous, heretical, or politically damaging, your bedchamber companions will remember every word. Your sleeping chambers are equipped with multiple escape routes in case of attack, but those same routes could be used by enemies to enter. Secret passages that could save your life could also deliver your death. Every convenience is also a vulnerability. The temperature in your stone castle means you're either freezing under insufficient blankets or suffocating under too many layers. Finding the perfect balance between warmth and mobility in case you need to run for your life is a nightly challenge that would frustrate modern interior designers. Noise control is another concern. Sleep too deeply to hear approaching threats, and you die in your bed. Sleep too lightly and wake at every sound, and you'll be exhausted and mentally compromised. The castle is full of normal nighttime sounds, servants moving around, guards changing shifts, animals in the courtyard that could mask the sounds of approaching assassins. Your chamber windows are narrow and high for defensive purposes, but they also limit your ability to escape if the main doors are blocked. They let in minimal light, making it difficult to identify threats in the darkness, but they also prevent easy access for enemies trying to enter from outside. Even your personal hygiene becomes a security concern. Medieval toothbrushes could be poisoned, Face creams could contain toxic substances. Hair oils could be laced with contact poisons. The most intimate aspects of your bedtime routine could be weapons turned against you by enemies with access to your personal supplies. So you lie in your royal bed, surrounded by luxury that could kill you, protected by guards who might betray you, sharing space with a husband who could be gathering intelligence for your enemies. Every breath could be your last, every moment of unconsciousness could be your final vulnerability. And this is considered the safe, private part of your day. Morning will bring new political challenges, new assassination attempts, new opportunities for everything to go catastrophically wrong. But for now, you close your eyes and try to sleep, knowing that tomorrow you'll wake up, if you wake up, to do it all over again. You've survived one complete day as a medieval queen. Congratulations, you've navigated poisoned food, political intrigue, religious manipulation, economic catastrophe, social warfare, and bedtime assassination attempts. But here's the truly terrifying part. This isn't an unusually dangerous day. This is just Tuesday. Every single day of your reign will be exactly like this. The faces might change, the specific threats might vary, but the constant pressure, the endless paranoia, the relentless political calculations, that's your life now. For however long your life lasts, which statistically isn't very long. Medieval queens didn't typically die of old age. They died of childbirth complications, mysterious illnesses that looked suspiciously like poisoning, convenient accidents, and sudden disappearances that nobody talked about afterward. The crown wasn't just heavy, it was often a death sentence with a delayed execution date. Consider some actual historical examples. Queen Joan of Navarre, accused of witchcraft and imprisoned by her own stepson. Queen Isabella of France, who helped orchestrate her husband's brutal murder. Queen Margaret of Anjou, who spent decades fighting civil wars to protect her son's inheritance. These weren't aberrations, they were typical royal careers. The romantic medieval fantasy of gracious queens living in beautiful castles is pure fiction. The reality was political terror, constant surveillance, and the knowledge that every person who smiled at you might be calculating the best method to ensure you never smiled again. And yet, despite all of this, some women not only survived medieval queenship, but actually thrived in it. They learned to use the system's brutality to their own advantage, turning political manipulation into an art form and transforming their supposed weakness into unexpected strength. But those were exceptional women with exceptional skills, operating in exceptionally favourable circumstances. The average person, male or female, thrust into medieval royal politics wouldn't last a week, let alone build a lasting dynasty. So the next time you complain about your job, your relationships, or your living situation, remember that at least nobody is trying to poison your breakfast, manipulate your religious beliefs for political gain, or assassinate you in your sleep. Modern life might have its problems, but at least you can eat a sandwich without wondering if it's going to kill you. The medieval world was beautiful in its art, architecture, and literature, but living in it, especially at the highest levels of power, was a special kind of nightmare that makes modern political corruption look like a polite disagreement between neighbours. Now let's step away from the blood-soaked thrones of medieval Europe and travel across time and continents to discover another woman who refused to let the world define her limits. Long before she became one of the most powerful rulers in African history, she was simply Nzinga, a princess learning the brutal realities of 17th century politics in what is now Angola. Born around 1583, she entered a world where Portuguese colonisers were systematically destroying her homeland, enslaving her people, and reducing proud kingdoms to tributary states. Her father, Kilwanjikia Samba, was the Ngola, king of the Ndongo kingdom. The title was so important that Portuguese colonizers adopted it as the name for the entire region, Angola. But by the time Nzinga was old enough to understand politics, her father's kingdom was under siege from multiple directions. Portuguese slave traders, backed by superior military technology and ruthless commercial ambition, were capturing thousands of her people every month. They built massive fortified trading posts along the coast and pushed inland with increasing aggression. Their goal wasn't just to trade, it was to control, to dominate, to transform an entire continent into a source of human merchandise. Nzinga grew up watching her father struggle with impossible choices, resist the Portuguese, and they would destroy his kingdom with cannons and muskets that African weapons couldn't match. Collaborate with them, and he would become complicit in the enslavement of his own people. Try to play both sides, and he would satisfy nobody while accomplishing nothing. The young princess learned political lessons that European queens could never imagine. How to negotiate with enemies who viewed you as subhuman. How to build military alliances when your potential allies were also being targeted for enslavement. How to preserve cultural identity when foreign invaders were systematically destroying everything that made your civilization unique. Her education wasn't limited to domestic palace intrigue, and Nzinga learned warfare, diplomacy, trade negotiations, and military strategy. In her culture, royal women weren't decorative figures. They were expected to be competent leaders who could step into power when circumstances demanded it. She watched her brother Mbandi inherit the throne when their father died, and she observed how his attempts to appease the Portuguese only emboldened their aggression. Collaboration didn't bring peace, it brought more demands, more territorial encroachment, more systematic destruction of Ndongo independence. The Portuguese weren't interested in fair treaties or mutual respect. They wanted submission, tribute, and an endless supply of enslaved people to ship to their Brazilian colonies. They used divide and conquer tactics, supporting rival claimants to African thrones and turning neighbouring kingdoms against each other. By the time Nzinga reached adulthood, she had witnessed the systematic demolition of the world her ancestors had built. Traditional trade routes had been disrupted. Cultural institutions had been undermined. The delicate balance of power between different African kingdoms had been shattered by Portuguese manipulation. But rather than accepting defeat, Nzinga began developing the skills that would make her one of the most formidable opponents European colonizers ever faced. She learned Portuguese language and customs, not to assimilate, but to understand her enemies better. She studied European military tactics, not to admire them, but to develop counter-strategies. Most importantly, she began to envision a different kind of resistance, not the desperate, reactive warfare that had failed her father and brother, but strategic, long-term opposition that could outlast Portuguese patience and colonial resources. She was preparing for a war that would define her life and reshape the history of Central Africa. A war between European imperialism and African independence, between slave traders and freedom fighters, between those who saw Africa as a resource to be exploited and those who knew it as a homeland to be defended. And Nzinga didn't know that she would become a queen, a military commander, a diplomat, and a symbol of African resistance. But she was already becoming the kind of person who could carry those roles with the strength they would require. In 1617, when Queen Nzinga was in her 30s, her brother King Mbandi found himself in an impossible position. The Portuguese were demanding more tribute, more territory, and more enslaved people than his kingdom could possibly provide. Their military pressure was intensifying, and their local allies were growing bolder in their attacks. Desperate for some kind of diplomatic solution, Mbandi made a decision that would change African history. He sent his sister, Nzinga, to negotiate with the Portuguese governor in Luanda. It was an unprecedented move, sending a woman to conduct high-level diplomatic negotiations with European colonizers who barely recognized African men as human beings. But Mbandi knew his sister possessed qualities that made her uniquely suited for this impossible mission. She was fluent in Portuguese, knowledgeable about European customs, and politically astute enough to navigate complex negotiations. More importantly, she had something that most African diplomats lacked: absolutely nothing to lose. Nzinga arrived in Luanda in 1622 for what would become one of the most famous diplomatic encounters in African history. The Portuguese governor, João Correia de Sousa, had arranged the meeting room to emphasise European superiority and African subordination. He sat in an ornate chair while providing only a floor mat for the African princess. The message was clear: kneel before European authority, accept your inferior position, and beg for terms that we might graciously consider. It was a calculated humiliation designed to establish the psychological foundation for whatever agreement might follow. Nzinga's response became legendary. Rather than kneeling on the mat or standing awkwardly while the governor sat comfortably, she signalled to one of her attendants, who immediately got down on hands and knees. Nzinga then sat regally on her attendant's back, elevating herself to the governor's eye level and transforming the power dynamic of the entire encounter. The governor was speechless. No African leader had ever responded to Portuguese diplomatic protocol with such creative defiance. Nzinga had simultaneously acknowledged the seating arrangement while completely subverting its intended meaning. She was negotiating as an equal, not as a supplicant. The negotiations that followed were equally remarkable. Nzinga didn't just argue for better terms for her brother's kingdom. She systematically dismantled the Portuguese justification for their colonial aggression. She questioned their legal authority, challenged their religious pretensions, and exposed the contradictions in their claims about bringing civilization to Africa. She pointed out that her people had been trading, building, governing, and creating art for centuries before Portuguese ships appeared on their shores. She noted that Portuguese civilization seemed to consist primarily of kidnapping, murder, and theft. She wondered aloud why people who claimed to represent the Prince of Peace spent most of their time waging aggressive wars against peaceful neighbours. The Portuguese governor found himself in the unprecedented position of having to defend European colonialism to someone who clearly understood its mechanisms better than most Europeans did. And Nzinga wasn't just negotiating, she was conducting a devastating critique of the entire colonial enterprise. But she was also practical. She understood that her brother's kingdom couldn't survive continued Portuguese aggression, and she was willing to accept certain compromises to secure breathing room for her people. The treaty that emerged from these negotiations was far more favourable to Ndongo than anyone had expected. However, Nzinga also understood that the Portuguese had no intention of honouring any agreements that limited their expansion or reduced their access to enslaved people. The negotiations were buying time, not achieving permanent peace. She was already planning for the next phase of the conflict. When she returned to her brother's court, she brought more than just a treaty. She brought a clear understanding of Portuguese weaknesses, a demonstrated ability to hold her own in diplomatic encounters with European officials, and a growing reputation as someone who could stand up to colonial pressure. The stage was set for her transformation from diplomatic negotiator to military commander, from princess to queen, from local leader to continental symbol of resistance. The Portuguese had no idea that they had just met the woman who would make their lives miserable for the next 4 decades. Nzinga had discovered something that would define the rest of her career. European colonizers could be outmaneuvered, outsmarted, and outlasted by African leaders who were willing to match their ruthlessness with superior strategy and unbreakable determination. When Nzinga returned from her diplomatic triumph in Luanda, she found her brother's kingdom in even deeper crisis. The treaty she had negotiated was already being violated by Portuguese forces who had apparently interpreted peace agreement as temporary pause before renewed aggression. King Mbandi was spiralling into despair and paranoia. The constant pressure from Portuguese forces, combined with the impossible demands of maintaining traditional leadership while accommodating colonial realities, had broken something fundamental in his character. He began making increasingly erratic decisions that alienated his own supporters while failing to appease his Portuguese enemies. In 1624, Mbandi died under mysterious circumstances that were never fully explained. Some claimed he committed suicide rather than face continued humiliation. Others whispered about poison administered by Portuguese agents or rival African factions. Nzinga herself would later be accused of orchestrating her brother's death, though no convincing evidence was ever presented. What mattered more than the cause of Mbandi's death was what happened next. Nzinga moved quickly to secure the throne, but her path to power wasn't automatic or uncontested. Traditional succession rules in Ndongo were complex, and several other claimants had legitimate arguments for why they should rule. More importantly, the Portuguese had their own preferred candidate for the Ndongo throne, Mbandi's young son, who could be easily manipulated and controlled. They began mobilizing military support for the boy, while simultaneously encouraging other African leaders to challenge Nzinga's claim. But Nzinga had spent years preparing for exactly this moment. Her diplomatic success in Luanda had demonstrated her competence to skeptical nobles. Her understanding of Portuguese tactics gave her strategic advantages that other claimants lacked. Most importantly, she offered something that no other potential ruler could provide: a realistic plan for sustained resistance against colonial encroachment. Her coronation in 1624 was both a celebration and a declaration of war. She wasn't just becoming queen, she was announcing her intention to reverse decades of Portuguese gains and restore Ndongo independence. The Portuguese responded predictably. They declared her illegitimate, refused to recognise her authority, and began organising military campaigns to remove her from power. What followed was a chess match that would last for decades. The Portuguese had superior weapons, better funding, and reliable support from European allies, but Nzinga had superior knowledge of local terrain, deeper understanding of regional politics, and something that no amount of military technology could overcome: the complete commitment of someone fighting for her homeland's survival. She began by consolidating power within her own kingdom, eliminating rivals who might be tempted to collaborate with Portuguese forces. This wasn't just political calculation, it was military necessity. Divided African resistance would be defeated African resistance. Simultaneously, she started building alliances with neighbouring kingdoms that were facing similar Portuguese pressure. The colonisers had been successful partly because they could defeat African opponents, one at a time. Nzinga understood that coordinated resistance across multiple kingdoms would be much harder to overcome. Her military strategy was equally innovative. Rather than trying to match Portuguese forces in conventional battles where superior European weapons would decide the outcome, she developed guerrilla tactics that emphasized mobility, surprise, and intimate knowledge of local geography. She also began incorporating Portuguese military innovations into her own forces. Captured muskets were reverse-engineered by African smiths. Portuguese military tactics were studied and adapted for African use. She was fighting European imperialism with European methods, but in service of African independence. The transformation was remarkable. Within months of taking power, Nzinga had converted a failing kingdom into an effective resistance movement. The Portuguese found themselves facing not just another African ruler they could intimidate or bribe, but a strategic opponent who seemed to anticipate their moves and counter them effectively. Queen Nzinga wasn't just ruling, she was revolutionizing the nature of African resistance to European colonialism, and the Portuguese were about to discover that their previous colonial victories had not prepared them for this level of opposition. By the late 1620s, Queen Nzinga had transformed her kingdom into something the Portuguese had never encountered, an African state that was actually getting stronger under colonial pressure rather than weaker. Her military innovations, diplomatic alliances, and political reforms were creating a resistance movement that threatened the entire Portuguese colonial project in Central Africa. The Portuguese response was predictably brutal. They escalated their military campaigns, targeting not just Nzinga's armies, but the civilian populations that supported her resistance movement. Their strategy was to make the cost of resistance so high that her people would abandon her leadership and accept Portuguese rule. It backfired spectacularly. The more brutal the Portuguese became, the more determined Nzinga's supporters became. Portuguese atrocities convinced wavering African leaders that collaboration was impossible. The colonizers weren't interested in peaceful coexistence, only in total domination. Nzinga's military tactics evolved to meet the increased Portuguese aggression. She developed a network of hidden fortifications throughout her territory, connected by secret paths that allowed her forces to move quickly while remaining invisible to Portuguese scouts. Her armies could appear suddenly to attack Portuguese convoys, then disappear before reinforcements arrived. She also pioneered what modern military theorists would recognize as psychological warfare. Her forces adopted terrifying war paint and battle cries designed to demoralize Portuguese soldiers who were already nervous about fighting in unfamiliar African terrain. Many Portuguese troops reported having nightmares about her warriors, even when no actual battles were occurring. But perhaps her most innovative strategy was economic warfare. Nzinga systematically disrupted Portuguese trade routes, making their colonial operations so expensive and unreliable that they struggled to maintain profitable operations. She understood that European colonialism was fundamentally a business enterprise. Make it unprofitable, and it would eventually collapse. Her diplomatic efforts extended far beyond Central Africa. She established contact with other African resistance movements, sharing tactical knowledge and coordinating strategies. She also reached out to European rivals of Portugal, including the Dutch, who were happy to provide weapons and supplies to anyone who would cause problems for their Portuguese competitors. The Portuguese found themselves fighting a war on multiple fronts against an opponent who seemed to understand their weaknesses better than they understood them themselves. Nzinga had transformed from a defensive African ruler into an aggressive force that was actively undermining Portuguese colonial authority. In 1629, the Portuguese achieved what they thought would be a decisive victory. They captured Nzinga's capital and forced her into exile. They celebrated this as the end of organised resistance in the region and began making plans for the complete pacification of Central Africa. They were wrong. Nzinga's exile wasn't a defeat, it was a strategic retreat that allowed her to rebuild her forces while the Portuguese struggled to govern territory they had conquered but couldn't control. Her supporters continued guerrilla operations, while she established new alliances and developed even more sophisticated resistance strategies. More importantly, her exile transformed her from a regional leader into a continental symbol. Other African resistance movements began invoking her name and adopting her tactics. The Portuguese had created exactly what they were trying to prevent, a legendary figure who inspired opposition to European colonialism across a huge geographical area. When Nzinga returned from exile in 1631, she wasn't just reclaiming her throne, she was launching a continental movement that would challenge European assumptions about African capabilities and African resistance, the Portuguese colonial project, which had seemed unstoppable just a few years earlier, was about to face its greatest test. The woman who had once sat on her attendant's back to negotiate as an equal with a Portuguese governor was now commanding armies, forging international alliances, and rewriting the rules of anti-colonial warfare. Queen Nzinga had become something that European colonial theory claimed was impossible, an African leader who was winning. Queen Nzinga's return from exile in 1631 marked the beginning of what historians now recognise as one of the most sophisticated anti-colonial campaigns in African history. She had spent 2 years in exile studying Portuguese weaknesses, building new alliances and developing military innovations that would revolutionise African resistance to European imperialism. Her new strategy was breathtakingly ambitious. Rather than simply defending her traditional territory, she would actively expand her influence to create a powerful confederation of African states united in opposition to Portuguese colonialism. It was a vision that went far beyond traditional African political structures and challenged the fundamental assumptions of European colonial strategy. She began by establishing her new capital at Matamba, a strategically located kingdom that gave her control over crucial trade routes while remaining difficult for Portuguese forces to attack. Matamba became not just a political centre, but a refuge for people fleeing Portuguese slave raids and a training ground for anti-colonial warfare. Nzinga's military innovations during this period were remarkable. She created an integrated command structure that combined traditional African military units with captured Portuguese weapons and tactics. Her forces included infantry armed with muskets, cavalry units that could move quickly across vast distances, and specialised units trained in siege warfare. More importantly, she revolutionised the social structure of her military forces. Traditional African armies typically included only men, but Nzinga created mixed-gender military units, where women fought alongside men as equals. She personally led troops into battle, wielding weapons and making tactical decisions that determined the outcome of major engagements. This wasn't just military innovation, it was social revolution. By proving that women could be effective military commanders and combat soldiers, Nzinga challenged both African and European assumptions about gender roles. Portuguese colonial officials found themselves fighting wars against armies that included female generals, female cavalry officers, and female infantry units. Her diplomatic strategies were equally revolutionary. Rather than trying to negotiate with Portuguese colonial officials who viewed Africans as inherently inferior, she began conducting direct diplomatic relations with European governments, presenting herself as the legitimate ruler of a sovereign African state that deserved recognition under international law. She established formal diplomatic relations with the Dutch, who were competing with Portugal for control of African trade routes. The Dutch provided her with weapons, military advisors, and diplomatic support in exchange for her promise to disrupt Portuguese colonial operations. It was one of the first formal military alliances between a European power and an independent African state. Nzinga also pioneered what modern analysts would recognise as information warfare. She systematically spread stories about Portuguese brutality and incompetence throughout Central Africa, undermining colonial authority and encouraging resistance movements in other regions. Her agents operated throughout Portuguese-controlled territory, gathering intelligence and organising sabotage operations. The economic dimension of her resistance was particularly sophisticated. She established alternative trade networks that bypassed Portuguese commercial monopolies, creating prosperity for her subjects while simultaneously undermining colonial revenue streams. Her territories became zones of economic freedom where African merchants could trade directly with Dutch, French, and English commercial agents. By the mid-1630s, Nzinga controlled a confederation that included multiple kingdoms and extended across hundreds of miles of Central African territory. Portuguese colonial officials found themselves dealing with an opponent who commanded resources, allies, and strategic capabilities that rivaled European colonial powers. Her success inspired resistance movements throughout Africa. Other African leaders began adopting her military tactics, diplomatic strategies, and political innovations. The Portuguese colonial project, which had seemed unstoppable at the beginning of the century, was facing coordinated opposition across the entire continent. But Nzinga's greatest achievement was proving that African political and military capabilities were equal to European capabilities when given equal resources and opportunities. She had demonstrated that European colonial success wasn't based on inherent superiority, but on temporary, technological, and organisational advantages that could be overcome through strategic innovation and determined resistance. The Portuguese were about to learn that their colonial empire was far more fragile than they had realised, and that African resistance was far more sophisticated than they had ever imagined. By the 1640s, Queen Nzinga had achieved something that European colonial theorists claimed was impossible. She had created an independent African state that was not only surviving European colonial pressure, but actually thriving and expanding under it. Her confederation controlled crucial trade routes, commanded sophisticated military forces, and maintained diplomatic relations with multiple European powers. The Portuguese colonial administration in Angola was in crisis. Their attempts to defeat Nzinga through military force had failed repeatedly. Their efforts to undermine her through diplomatic isolation had backfired as other European powers began recognizing her legitimacy. Their economic strategies were being systematically disrupted by her alternative trade networks. More alarming for Portuguese officials was the spread of Nzinga's resistance model to other parts of Africa. Her success was inspiring independence movements throughout the continent, creating a network of coordinated opposition that threatened the entire European colonial project. What had begun as a local dispute over tributary payments had evolved into a continental challenge to European imperial authority. Nzinga's personal leadership during this period was extraordinary by any historical standard. She was simultaneously commanding military campaigns, conducting international diplomacy, managing complex economic policies, and maintaining the cultural institutions that held her diverse confederation together. She was proving that African political leadership could match European political leadership when given equal opportunities. Her military innovations continued to evolve throughout the 1640s. She developed specialized units trained in different types of warfare, siege specialists for attacking Portuguese fortifications, cavalry units for rapid strikes across long distances, and intelligence units for gathering information about Portuguese plans and weaknesses. She also pioneered the use of what modern military analysts would recognize as special operations forces, small, highly trained units that could penetrate Portuguese-controlled territory, conduct sabotage operations, and disappear before Portuguese forces could respond. These units made Portuguese colonial administration extremely difficult and expensive. Her diplomatic achievements were equally remarkable. She maintained formal embassies in multiple European capitals, conducted treaty negotiations as an equal with European governments, and successfully played European rivals against each other to advance African interests. She was conducting international relations at a level of sophistication that most European rulers never achieved. The economic prosperity of her confederation attracted attention throughout Africa and Europe. Her territories offered security, opportunity, and freedom that were unavailable in Portuguese-controlled areas. Refugees from Portuguese colonial oppression swelled her population, bringing skills and knowledge that further strengthened her state. But perhaps her most important achievement was cultural and intellectual. She maintained African cultural institutions while selectively adopting useful European innovations. Her confederation preserved traditional African languages, religions, and social structures while incorporating European military technology, diplomatic practices, and commercial methods. This synthesis of African and European elements created something new, a modernized African state that was culturally authentic, technologically advanced, and politically sophisticated. She was proving that African societies could adapt to European contact without losing their essential African character. By the late 1640s, the Portuguese were privately acknowledging that they could not defeat Nzinga through military means. Her confederation was too strong, her alliances too extensive, and her strategic capabilities too sophisticated. They began exploring the possibility of negotiating a permanent peace agreement that would recognize her independence. But Nzinga wasn't interested in simply achieving peaceful coexistence with Portuguese colonialism. She wanted to roll back Portuguese colonial gains and restore African independence throughout the region. Her vision extended far beyond her own confederation to encompass the liberation of all African territories under European colonial control. The stage was set for the final phase of her resistance campaign, an ambitious effort to drive Portuguese colonial forces out of Central Africa entirely and establish a new model for African-European relations based on equality rather than domination. Queen Nzinga was no longer just fighting for her own kingdom's independence. She was fighting for the future of African civilization itself. The 1650s marked the culmination of Queen Nzinga's decades-long resistance campaign against Portuguese colonialism. Now in her 70s, but still personally leading military campaigns, she had become something unprecedented in the history of European-African relations. An African leader who had not only survived sustained European pressure, but had actually forced European colonial powers to treat her as an equal. The Portuguese colonial administration in Angola was exhausted. 40 years of warfare against Nzinga had drained their resources, demoralized their forces, and undermined their authority throughout Central Africa. Colonial officials in Luanda were privately acknowledging that they could not defeat her confederation through military means, and would have to negotiate some form of permanent accommodation. But Nzinga understood that any peace agreement with the Portuguese would be temporary unless it addressed the fundamental issues that had caused the conflict in the first place. The Portuguese colonial system was based on the systematic exploitation of African resources and the enslavement of African people. As long as that system remained in place, conflict was inevitable. Her strategy during this final phase was to force the Portuguese to choose between maintaining their colonial system and achieving peace with her confederation. She made it clear that she would accept no agreement that allowed continued Portuguese slave raiding in her territories, or that required her people to pay tribute to European colonial authorities. Simultaneously, she intensified her efforts to build a continental coalition of African resistance movements. Her diplomats and military advisors were operating throughout Africa, sharing tactical knowledge and coordinating strategies with other leaders who were challenging European colonial authority. The Portuguese found themselves facing not just Nzinga's confederation, but a network of allied African states that were coordinating their resistance efforts and sharing resources. What had begun as a local conflict in Angola had evolved into a continental challenge to European colonial authority. In 1656, Portuguese colonial officials finally agreed to negotiate a comprehensive peace treaty that would recognise Nzinga's independence and establish formal diplomatic relations between Portugal and her confederation. The negotiations took place in Luanda, the same city where Nzinga had conducted her famous diplomatic mission 34 years earlier. The treaty that emerged from these negotiations was unprecedented in the history of European-African relations. Portugal formally recognised Nzinga as the legitimate queen of an independent African state. They agreed to end slave raiding in her territories and to conduct trade with her confederation on terms of equality rather than colonial subordination. More importantly, the treaty established diplomatic protocols that treated Nzinga's confederation as a sovereign state rather than a colonial dependency. Portuguese officials would have to follow the same diplomatic procedures in dealing with her government that they used in dealing with European governments. The signing ceremony was carefully orchestrated to emphasise the equality of the two parties. Unlike her earlier diplomatic encounter in Luanda, this time Nzinga was provided with a throne equal in status to that of the Portuguese governor. The symbolic message was clear. This was a negotiation between equals, not a colonial authority granting privileges to a subordinate. But even as she achieved this diplomatic triumph, Nzinga understood that the broader struggle for African independence was far from over. The Portuguese agreement applied only to her confederation and could be revoked if Portuguese colonial policy changed. The fundamental challenge of European colonialism remained. Her final years were dedicated to consolidating the achievements of her resistance campaign and establishing institutions that could survive her death. She worked to codify the military innovations, diplomatic strategies and political structures that had made her success possible, ensuring that future African leaders could build on her achievements. She also focused on cultural preservation, establishing schools and libraries that would maintain African languages, histories, and traditions while incorporating useful European knowledge. Her confederation became a centre of African learning that attracted scholars and students from across the continent. When Queen Nzinga died in 1663, at the age of 80, she had achieved something that European colonial theory claimed was impossible. She had created an independent African state that successfully resisted European colonial pressure for 4 decades while building prosperity, security, and cultural vitality for her people. Her funeral was attended by diplomatic representatives from multiple European governments, a recognition of her status as one of the most significant political leaders of her era. But her greatest legacy wasn't the diplomatic recognition she had achieved. It was the proof she had provided that African political capabilities were equal to European political capabilities when given equal opportunities. Queen Nzinga had demonstrated that European colonial success wasn't based on inherent superiority, but on temporary advantages that could be overcome through strategic innovation, determined resistance, and sophisticated leadership. She had shown that African independence was not only possible, but sustainable when pursued with sufficient skill and commitment. Her example would inspire African resistance movements for centuries, providing both tactical knowledge and psychological encouragement for leaders who faced similar challenges. She had proven that no colonial system, however powerful it might appear, was invincible when confronted by competent, determined opposition. The woman who had once sat on her attendant's back to assert her equality with a Portuguese governor had become a continental symbol of African resistance to European imperialism. Queen Nzinga hadn't just won her own freedom, she had shown that African freedom itself was achievable. Now, as we reach the end of our journey through these tales of extraordinary women who refuse to be limited by their circumstances, let's take a moment to reflect on what their stories reveal about human potential and the courage required to challenge the limitations that society places on our lives. Whether we're talking about a medieval queen navigating deadly political intrigue, Queen Nzinga building a confederation that could resist European colonialism, or Marie-Jeanne creating revolutionary educational theories, these women shared certain characteristics that enabled them to achieve the seemingly impossible. They refused to accept that their circumstances defined their possibilities. The medieval queen could have accepted that royal women were supposed to be decorative and passive. Queen Nzinga could have accepted that African resistance to European colonialism was futile. Marie-Jeanne could have accepted that women weren't supposed to be serious intellectuals. Instead, they analysed their situations, identified opportunities that others missed, and developed strategies that transformed their apparent disadvantages into sources of strength. They turned limitations into launching pads for innovation. They also understood that individual achievement was connected to broader social progress. None of these women was pursuing purely personal goals. They were working to create better conditions for their communities, their societies, and future generations. The medieval queen, despite the dangers of her position, used her power to protect her subjects and advance their welfare. Queen Nzinga fought not just for her own independence, but for the freedom of all African people under colonial oppression. Marie-Jeanne developed educational theories that would benefit countless children and students. Perhaps most importantly, these women understood that lasting change requires both courage and strategy. They weren't reckless rebels who challenged authority without thinking through the consequences. They were sophisticated strategists who carefully analysed their situations and developed realistic plans for achieving their goals. Their stories remind us that the most significant historical changes are often accomplished by individuals who combine visionary thinking with practical intelligence, who refuse to accept limitations while also understanding how to work within existing systems to create new possibilities. As you settle into sleep tonight, perhaps you can take some inspiration from these remarkable women who proved that human potential is far greater than society typically acknowledges. They remind us that the boundaries we accept in our own lives might be more flexible than we realise. The medieval queen who woke up in a world determined to kill her found ways to survive and thrive. Queen Nzinga transformed a struggling kingdom into a powerful confederation that successfully resisted colonial oppression. Marie-Jeanne revolutionised education while creating children's literature that continues to inspire readers centuries later. Each of them started with circumstances that seemed to limit their possibilities, but ended with achievements that expanded possibilities for countless others. They proved that individual courage, applied strategically and persistently, can reshape not just personal circumstances, but entire societies. Their stories also remind us that progress is never guaranteed and always requires individuals willing to challenge conventional wisdom, take calculated risks, and persist through difficulties that would discourage most people. So as you drift off to sleep, remember that the limitations you face in your own life might be more malleable than they appear. The women we've met tonight prove that human beings are capable of extraordinary achievements when they combine courage with intelligence, persistence with strategy, and individual ambition with social responsibility. Sweet dreams, and may you wake up tomorrow with a little more confidence in your own potential to challenge limitations and create new possibilities in your own life and the lives of others. The medieval world was brutal, colonial systems were oppressive, and traditional gender roles were restrictive. But determined individuals found ways to transcend these limitations and create legacies that continue to inspire us centuries later. Their stories remind us that every generation faces challenges that seem insurmountable, but also contains individuals capable of finding innovative solutions that seemed impossible until someone actually achieved them. You might not be facing deadly political intrigue, colonial oppression, or educational restrictions, But whatever limitations you're confronting in your own life, these remarkable women prove that human creativity, courage, and persistence can overcome obstacles that initially appear insurmountable. Their legacy isn't just the specific achievements they accomplished, but the proof they provided that human potential is far greater than most societies acknowledge, or most individuals dare to pursue. Sleep well, dream boldly, and remember that the most extraordinary achievements often begin with someone deciding that the limitations everyone else accepts don't actually have to define what's possible. Good night.